Hi, everyone. I hope you're all doing well. So today I want to finish up with chapter 34. But before I start, I just want to say you're all doing really, really well in terms of your grade and participation. I think if you're anything like me, you're getting fed up with all of this and you're ready to kind of move on and get over with um, the quarantine, maybe even get back to school in the fall at least. Um, but anyway, I don't want to take too much of your time. Let's go ahead and get started so that we can finish up this chapter. I got a Kahoot to do. This week should be fairly simple. Okay, so in the 1970s, life changed a lot. So I was born in the 1960s. And growing up, and I've told you this in class before, it was very rare that I ever met anyone in the United States who didn't speak English or, for the most part, didn't look like me because I grew up in Oregon and that's known as the White Belt. Growing up in military installations, though, we lived in military housing and then I told you we moved to the projects. There were African Americans, and for me it was like, okay, so in the United States there are black people and there were white people, and I didn't really think about it too much. But then things started to change. We started to see people coming from other parts of the world, from Asia and mostly from Latin America. People were Hispanic. It changed because the laws changed, right? But if you look at this right here, this chart, there are two main periods of time in our nation where immigration just really skyrockets. One of them is right here at the turn of the century. Let me see if I can get, there it is, right there. And there were a lot of people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were trying to flee poverty there, and they were drawn here to the United States because they wanted a better life. They wanted to work in our factories. And then it changed here. You can see it start to go up right here in the 1960s, right? And it went up significantly. So what you may not know is why it went down. We've got this V-shaped thing going on right here. Part of the reason for it is that this was a reaction to a lot of white Americans not wanting people coming here from Southern Europe. You know, they were Catholic and they didn't speak English and that sort of thing. And also in 1917, there was the Red Scare. So people were fearful that there were communists coming into the country, and so they wanted to shut it down. The thing is, they passed a couple of very restrictive laws, first in 1921 and then again in 1924, which based the people coming into the country on the national origins. So we're going to get the Emergency Quota Act and then the National Origins Act. And the first one in 1921, it said that we're going to allow 3% of the people from specific countries to come into America. And specific countries, it was based on the percentage of people who were here. So if you had the percentage of people here, most people were like German and Irish and English. That we're going to take that whole number and then you can have 3% from there, 3% from Ireland, 3% from England, 3% from Italy, which there really weren't that many people from Italy, 3% from China. Oh no, not China, because remember there was the Chinese Exclusion Act. So what this did is it really based it on race and ethnicity. And so they got rid of that in 1965. And that was the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 65, and it was no longer based on quotas, but we'll talk about that in just a second. Here, I remember as a kid seeing on the news, because my parents always had the news on at night, and it's like another group of boat people arrived here in America today on the shores of California, and there would just be people just jam-packed, and it's amazing, these little tiny boats, you wouldn't even think that they were seaworthy, and they were just crowded in there, and somehow they made it across the Pacific. So you know they really must have wanted to come here, right? So a lot of people were fleeing from Cambodia and Vietnam because of everything that was going on there. People were getting away from communism in Cuba, so a lot of those people were going to Florida, mostly Miami, but other locations as well. And then you had a lot of people coming from China after after the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed after World War II, and the fact that Nixon made that trip there. So we're getting a lot of people from Latin America and from Asia. Okay, and you could see here the shift in the demographics. This chart right here, you can see that most people who came to the United States, 84% were from Canada and Europe. And then it breaks it down, right? You've got South and East Asia, right? So that's China, that's Vietnam, that's Cambodia. The biggest group of people, of course, were from Mexico, and I believe that it still is. And then here you've got other Latin American countries. And, all these people are coming here seeking a better life. Um, After the fall of the Soviet Union, you're going to see people coming from Eastern Europe, a lot of them coming from Poland. So it's going to change. If you look right here, the percent of foreign born reaches an all-time high in our nation's history. I mean, that's huge, huge percentage, right? Foreign born population, we've got like what, 41.3 million people, and that was in 2013. So there's been a lot of immigrants, and I think too there's been a reaction against that, and that was probably what helped Donald Trump get elected president in 2016, because people were like, you need to slow this down. It's just like in 1900, people were fearful that it was too fast, too many. American culture was changing, and people get uncomfortable with that. Here too, this lists the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, rather than it being based on national origins, which many believe was racist. It's based on the fact if you're a political refugee. So if anybody was coming from Cuba at that time, you would be allowed in, or the Soviet Union or something like that. Excuse me. Also, if you have family here, then that can allow you to come in too. What they've been trying to do is make it to where it's not like your second cousin to your father's sister's brother or something like that. It has to be a closer relationship, because family member, they need to define that. Also, it's skills based. So if you have a certain skill, maybe a company recruits, then they're going to want you here, or if you're a professional, right? Okay, so here's some of those images. The image at the left and then the one up here, these people are live, but what that is, these are some of these boat people. And I might have told you this story. I can remember one time I was getting my nails done. Ladies, you know that a lot of the people that do nails happen to come from Asia. And it's not that they're not qualified to do something else. And the book addressed this too. A lot of the people who come here, even though they might be highly trained in a certain field, they're not certified to practice, whether they're a lawyer or a professor or a doctor or something like that. They're not qualified to practice their field here in the United States, because they haven't passed a certain test. They don't speak English well enough or something like that. And so they end up doing those jobs that maybe pay less, right, or aren't as fulfilling. But anyway, I was getting my nails done from this one guy, and he had all these burn marks on his arm. And I said, well, what happened? And he said that somebody kept putting all these cigarette butts out in his arm. So while he was on one of these boats. The boat down here, though, this is obviously, that wouldn't have made it across the Pacific. Whoops. But it did make it from Cuba to Florida, which, if you're just looking at the Florida Keys, is not that far, right? So a lot of people who come to or came to the United States from Cuba, some of them even floated on rafts, right? They just got here wherever they could, and once they touched American soil, then they'd get refugee status. Okay, so with this changing population, the laws change too. And some people debated this. Some people say, well, if you're going to vote, you should be able to speak English. But Congress decided that if people are here and they're citizens, and they should get the right to vote, and so they need to understand what they're voting for. And so we get the Voting Rights Act of 1975. Remember the Voting Rights Act of 1965? This put voting registration under federal control in certain states, right? And I won't have any more coffee, sorry about that. But anyway, here it required that the voting material be in a different language. So if you have a large Polish population in a neighborhood of Chicago, then the voting, um, the ballots and all the information should be in Polish, right? Also with education. Now, if one of you didn't speak English and I'm sitting there trying to teach you contemporary American history, you're not going to learn it. And so what they did is they passed a law. It was the Bilingual Education Act, and this would give money to the states in order to educate students in their foreign language while they are learning English in another classroom. I can't remember who I was talking to, but a student like last year or the year before, his sister was teaching at a school out in California, and they had kids who spoke like 30 different languages, and that school had to bring in all these different interpreters to teach them the subject matter, and then they would be learning English at the same time. So that's a huge expense for school districts, but the federal government is supposed to fund that. Okay, so if you look at those students who are speaking, those students who do not speak English, the overwhelming majority, at least this was in 1998, were Spanish, but you get some others too. You can see all of these right here are Asian and Southeast Asian. I believe that this, I'm not sure what it is, but I'm thinking it's Filipino. The Navajo language, of course, Native Americans, this is in the American Southwest, but it's making a comeback. More and more people who are Navajo are embracing their language and their heritage, whereas before, maybe 50 years ago, they were giving that up and just speaking English. Now they're, like I said, they're embracing it. Same in Hawaii. Okay, and then this is another chart. This is more interesting because if you look back at 1900, 1910, in here, the population was a lot lower, right? So you're getting like 13.5%, but that made up 14.7% of the population. And then here we're almost reaching that. We're at like 13.3%. So when you've got a country where 13% of the population is immigrants, that is going to create maybe for a lot of people some angst, why is it, 1 in 10 or 2 in 10 people don't speak my language, and when the culture kind of dictates that. So some people do get a little uncomfortable when there's that such high number there. Okay, this is another indication of that. So this was around 1900, and then this is closer to today, even though it's not as up to date as it should be. Okay, so again, looking at, it says here, and I made this a couple of years ago, quite a few years ago actually, I should update it, but there are 31 million immigrants living in the United States. I think that it's closer to 40 million, and as the chart before showed, it's closer to 13% of our population. But here in 2001, here you can see most of those people were from Mexico, and then you got Asia, other Latin American countries. The only other one that's not Latin America or Asia is Bosnia. And a lot of people are coming over after the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina that took place in the 1990s. People escaping war, famine, poverty, looking for a better life coming here. Okay, this is a cartoon. I don't know, you probably won't think it's very funny, but it's a good illustration. Here, this teacher, sorry, bilingual education's been voted down here in California, so we can't help you anymore. Understand? You'll probably fall behind. Oh well, the kid has no idea what the teacher's saying. All right, another thing that changed during the 1970s was the growth of the Sun Belt. A lot of people were leaving these industrial places in the north because a lot of those jobs started to close down. And now in this area from like New York over to Illinois, it's called the Rust Belt because we get the closing of these factories. So people were going to the south. Down in the south, a lot of companies were moving down there too because the land was cheaper and labor costs were lower. So the companies were down there. You also get, the defense jobs were down there, aerospace, other things. So a lot of people started moving down there for jobs. Businesses started to relocate there. It was warmer. People didn't really want to live there before because we got Lucy here. Say hi. Say hi. People didn't want to live there before because it was very hot. There was no air conditioning, there were no good roads. But with the development of those things, then more people started to go there. Also, more people started to go to the American South after the Civil Rights Movement. Even now, we see that a lot of Black people are wanting to go to the South, move there, kind of to find their family roots. They still have relatives there, and now they're more inclined to do that because you don't have Jim Crow or the oppressive nature. Here's a test question. About 7 million people migrated there from 1970 to 1978. Okay, there's also some other changes in lifestyle in the United States in that laws were changed not only in immigration but also in divorce. It used to be really difficult to get a divorce, but then the Congress changed those laws and divorce became easier. You can see up here, maybe you can. Nevada leads the way in the number of divorces in 2011. It's hard to read. I think then Alabama and then West Virginia, Oklahoma, Idaho, Wyoming. But anyway, so people are getting more divorces. It's not that people didn't necessarily like marriage, because many people are still getting remarried, right? And marriages continued. But it also changed in that when I grew up, I just wanted to say nobody's parents were divorced, right? There were no single parent households, and if you were, it was like scandalous, right? But that changed over time. Like by the end of the 1970s, 22.5% of the households had only one parent, right? A single parent, man or woman, mostly women, right? So the marriage rate, the remarriage rate increased, but also the divorce rate increased too. And women were having fewer children. They were making that choice. Of course, now they had access to birth control pill, but they didn't want 4 or 5 children. They started having smaller families at that time. Okay, and here you can see marriage and divorce rate, right? If you look, marriage rate really peaks right here at World War II, but so did the divorce rate somewhat, right? So people are going off to war and then they want to get married. But maybe they discovered too, stop it, that they shouldn't have gotten married, and so people get divorced. But if you see the divorce rate, this is where it peaks right here in 1980, and then since then it's gone down. Okay, and I think it continues to. But if you look here, though, since that time, the marriage rate's gone down too. If you look during the 1970s, the marriage rate pretty much stayed the same. All right, this is interesting. Look at Illinois. We have a lower than average divorce rate throughout the country. Some of the highest are down here in the South, mostly in the South, I would say. You know, but just thought that was interesting. Okay, we also get a movement towards self-improvement. So people are exercising more. There's this real big craze in running. And as a kid, you'd never see anybody just running down the street. If they did, they might have committed a crime or something, you don't know. But then in the 1970s, people just took this up and they started running, and there were all these marathons and everything else. They're exercising. This right here is a VHS tape, which came out in the 1970s of Jane Fonda. She was a famous actress and an activist, controversial activist. She was also the daughter of Henry Fonda, who was a famous actor, but she had a series of exercise videos that she put out. And these were aerobic exercises, and that became all the fad. And so for women and for some men. You know, you'd go with these leg warmers and tights or no tights at all, and a real skimpy aerobic outfit that was very high waisted, you know, like a swimsuit that you would exercise in. So that was a big deal. People were also smoking less. There was a big campaign to try to prevent people from smoking. Brooke Shields came on and would talk about how bad smoking was for you and how awful it was to go to a party and people were smoking and your hair would smell like smoke. So there's this big campaign for that. But there were some bad things too, which we'll talk about in a minute, I think. There was an increase in alcohol and also fast food, which I think we talk about coming up. But also there, people were looking for a different spirituality. This kind of continues from the 1960s, non-traditional religions, Hinduism, Buddhism. There was a group here, the People's Temple. It was out of California. They followed the teaching of Jim Jones, and that was Jonestown, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and also a movement towards a more simple, non-materialistic life. Okay, so this right here, this is Jim Jones, and he led up the People's Temple. It was an agricultural project. It started in California, and it was kind of like an anti-society religious organization where there was not going to be any racism or materialism. They're going to, banish war and those sorts of things. It was very idealistic, and initially it was very upbeat. Jim Jones convinced his congregation to go to the jungles of Guyana, which is a country in northern South America. So they go down there and they were visited by a congressman who was concerned because some of the people who were down there were writing to their family members expressing the notion that maybe they were being held against their will, that this was like a work camp, it was a cult, they went down there, they were hungry. And so the congressman comes down there and he was going to go back. He took some of the followers with him, but before he could leave, they were shot on the runway of the airstrip down there. And Jim Jones convinced many of the people there to kill themselves by drinking Kool-Aid that was laced with cyanide. So about 900 people died. Those who didn't take it voluntarily were forced to. Jim Jones ended up committing suicide by shooting himself in the head. Of the 900 people who committed suicide or were forced to drink the Kool-Aid, there were about 300 of them are children. Nowadays, if you just are like a sheep and you go along with some political view or something like that, there's an expression now, it's like, oh, you're drinking the Kool-Aid. You're just kind of going along with what other people tell you to do and not thinking freely for yourself. But these are some of the horrific pictures of that. I remember seeing that as a teenager. I was like, oh my God, this is awful. So these bodies are in the jungles of Guyana. It's very hot and humid down there, and you've got 900 dead bodies. Imagine what that scene must have been like. Here you can see this person has on a mask. The bodies there, they probably rigor mortis is set in. Right. Here you can see the vat of Kool-Aid. They would go and they would get a cup and dip it into it, and then they were supposed to drink it. All right, let's go back to better things. As I said, fitness became very popular, jogging, decreasing smoking. However, there was an increase in alcohol consumption and fast food consumption. I did not see my first McDonald's until I was about 13 years old. The first one was in, I think, Des Plaines, Illinois, up there. And then they just branched out, right? Ray Cohn did it, and they just branched out, and you get these franchises, and then pretty soon they went all over the country. And McDonald's, it says, was feeding more than the United States Army by 1972, right? And 35% of your food was prepared outside of the home by 1977. We hardly ever ate anywhere, outside the home. Dinner was always on the table at a certain time, and that's how most homes were until we start to see these fast food restaurants appearing. Okay, entertainment really changed. Okay, this is Jaws. I remember seeing this with my sister, and I was terrified. I know that probably many of you, if you watch it today, you think it's no big deal. This was the first big box office hit for Steven Spielberg, and Spielberg really revolutionized film. Movies became huge business at the time, and people started to go, mostly because of the way that he directed and produced these films, the special effects and everything else, a little bit of fear that was placed in there, anxiety, and people just really enjoyed it. Okay, so in the 1970s, there was a big change in music too. One of the biggest things, which was heartbreaking for so many people, was that the Beatles broke up in April of 1970. But also, music became just big business, right? And we saw that the most with like the smooth sounds of disco. A movie came out, Saturday Night Fever, with John Travolta, and it was about this. He was kind of, I want to say, a loser, but he lived with his parents. He was a grown man and he worked at a hardware store. But at night, that's when he was like this big star because he would go to the discotheque and he could dance and everything else. And so that's where he was. He was just really popular and unique. But that soundtrack, which was headed up by the Bee Gees, and the Bee Gees, you've got they're three brothers. They were from Australia. They're right here. I think one of them has passed away, but they had very high vocal sounds, and the beats were really good, and it was great for a discotheque. But then there were the opposite of that. There were the Ramones, right, and other punk rockers who kind of coined the phrase "disco sucks." But we're also going to get other rock bands. I know my favorite during the time, of course, was AC/DC, especially in the late 70s, really popular. And you see the emergence of some other performers as well that's going to change. You get some women like Donna Summers. Who would sing disco, and the discotheques, so these places where people would go to dance, were very popular. I think it was Club 51 in New York City or 21, I don't know. Real popular where anybody who was anybody went to, right? But the disco was really the most popular music of the era, and it just kind of I don't know, epitomized the 1970s, right? That's just kind of, it was like a symbol for that. Okay, we also get, and this actually happened in 1969, but it would continue into the 70s and 80s, the space program, first with all of the Apollo missions, and then later we're going to get the space shuttle into the 1980s. I can remember this, 1969, I was 6 years old, and I remember looking up at the moon that night, and it was on TV where they landed on the moon for the first time, and I couldn't figure out as a 6 year old, why can't I see it? I see the moon. Where's the spaceship? Right? I thought that it should be there. But two astronauts go up in this Apollo 11 spacecraft. They land on the moon, and Neil Armstrong, as he gets down, he's broadcasting this. Somehow it was all televised, and he said, "That's one small step for man." Not just a man, but man, like human beings, and one giant leap for mankind. And the whole world was watching, right? This was an accomplishment for the whole world, but the United States did it. That flag that is right there in this image is still, as far as we know, up there on the moon, right? So they went up there. There were a lot of other Apollo missions. They called it that. Six other ones went up there. One of them, Apollo 13, this was the subject for a movie. They went up there and it looked as if they were not going to make it back. They were having technical difficulties and everybody thought, oh gosh, they're just going to be lost and then die up there. They were able to correct it though and come back, but they were not able to go to the moon. But there are some other things too. We get Skylab that goes up there where they do a lot of research and everything and see what it's like to live up in space. And what this did is it led to, a lot of other inventions. I think freeze-dried food at that time. There's smoke detectors and other things because of the necessity for these missions. They developed a lot of different things. So very innovative. All right, so here's a little bit more about the Apollo 11 mission. It was July 16th, 1969, and that was the third mission, lunar mission, to go up to the moon. And as I said, it was Neil Armstrong. He was the commander of it, and then command module pilot was Michael Collins, and then Buzz Aldrin was there too. But Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong were the first two to step out there, right? So they were the first, and it took them. They launched on the 16th, but they landed on the 20th. There is a YouTube site right here where you can kind of see what happened as they walked on the moon without gravity. So this is Skylab. What do you think of that floating hunk of junk? I mean, it just looks like a tin can up there in space. The United States had this as its only exclusive remote like space center. They sent like 3 different missions up there to conduct scientific research, and they got some good information on how it was like living up in space. They got some images of like storms on the sun and other things. It was really small though. Well, in comparison, I guess it was kind of big. But it was supposed to be rebooted and it couldn't be rebooted. They had to give it up in 1974. It finally burnt up in 1979 in the Earth's atmosphere. Now what we do is we have the International Space Station that we share with other countries to do scientific research up in space, and they kind of keep adding and adjusting to that. Of course, we haven't been up for a while. Okay, and then there's a couple of other things we're going to talk about, some other innovations. This right here is Pong. So you can't really see it because my head is in the way. But if you look down at the bottom behind me, there's a little control thing and you got these little dials. So what you would do, you'd sit and dial it back and forth. The one on the right where the 12 is, it would move that thing back and forth and the ball would go back and forth, bing, bing. And we would sit and play it for quite some time in my friend's basement. But that was an innovation. You'd also have video cassette tapes. There was the answering machine, the remote control. That might have been the 80s, but late 70s, early 80s, we had remote control. So we could record things, that sort of thing. So there's some innovations, but probably none as important as the personal computer. This is going to be developed in the 1970s, and then by the 1980s, people would get these big PCs on their desk. So you have a monitor. A lot of times people would use a television screen, right, to do that. And you'd hook up this big boxy thing next to it. You'd have to have a keypad, and everything else. And the language that you use, it was DOS. So you had to understand this. This was before Microsoft and everything, Windows. So it was quite difficult to use the computers at the time. You had to be very knowledgeable of it. But these were some of the inventions of the day. And the PC was created by Steve Jobs and Stephen Wozniak in Steve Jobs' mom and dad's garage. Let me show you the next slide shows you an image of that. So this would have been the first Apple computer, right? Out of wood. So if you take off that top there that's screwed on, you'd see the circuit panel and everything. So that would be the first computer. The first personal computer, they had computers before, but they were very large. This one was much smaller. And so that's what made it unique. So they did this, first out of wood, and then they put it into some other components and created the Apple company, the Apple Computer Company, which just soared, right? Can you imagine investing in that at an early age? So anyway, that was going to have big ramifications for things to come. All right, I will see you guys in chapter 35. The only thing you have this week, you have this lecture, the quiz over this section, the video quiz, which I think you're going to enjoy, and then I'll have a Kahoot and then the test. All right, so I will see you next week. Thank you. Bye.